Well, thank you for joining us for this economic measurement research seminar today. And our speaker today is Robert Hill. He's professor of macroeconomics at the University of Graz in Austria. Robert has a very extensive publication record on economic measurement, considering, amongst many other things, price indices, real estate indicators, and comparisons of income and wealth across countries and within countries. He is and has been involved in many international efforts to develop economic statistics, including with the World Bank, the UN, and Eurostat. So we're very delighted to have you here. Recently also, Robert joined us working with ESCoE to develop our work on spatial statistics. So just a few house notes on the way we're going to run this seminar. First of all, to be aware, this is being recorded. Robert will speak for 40 to 45 minutes. And if you have any questions, you can please type them in the Q&A box. We'll take questions at the end. What we'll do is we'll call out your name and ask you to unmute so that you can ask the question yourself. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. Thank you.
Okay, so, well, thanks for having been given the chance to present in the ESCoE Economic Measurement Webinar series. So I'm going to present today a combination of, two papers of mine. And the common theme to both papers is that I'll be looking at the concept of the user cost concept applied to owner-occupied housing. So there are going to be two different applications. The first one, which is focusing on the first of these papers, Hill, Steuer, and Waltel, 2020, will be focusing on how you can use a user cost approach to include owner-occupied housing in measures of inflation, such as in the CPI. And the second paper is going to be looking at how you can use a user cost approach to determine the equilibrium price-rent ratio in the housing market. This is Chen, Hill, and Hu. I'll be looking at how you can use the user cost approach in these two contexts, but also problems that arise when you try and do this. So I'll spend maybe 2/3 of the time on the first paper and about 1/3 on the second. So, okay, so let's start then on the issue here with inflation measurements is how do you include owner-occupied housing in a CPI? Now, there are three main ways in the literature that have been discussed for doing this. See, for example, DWOT 2009 was discussions of these methods. So these methods are rental equivalence, net acquisitions, and some kind of user cost method. Now, whichever method you use to include anything in a price index, you need expenditure, an estimate of expenditure, so that you can generate a weight for that component in the CPI, and you also need a price index for that component. So the same applies for owner-occupied housing. You need to have an estimate of OOH expenditure and then a price index for OOH as well. And once you've got those two things, you can include it in the CPI as an additional element. Now, the standard way, I guess, is what's called rental equivalence, and this is how it's done in the UK in CPIH, for example, where you're imagining that owner-occupiers pay rent to themselves, so there's an imputed rent that they pay to themselves. And the way you'd actually implement this is you basically have to match up each, well, at least for a sample of owner-occupied properties with equivalent rental properties, and then like that you can get an imputed rent for the owner-occupied properties. And for the price index, you then just use a rent index. So that's kind of how rental equivalence works. The net acquisitions approach instead says that it tries to treat housing like consumer durables, like cars and refrigerators. So you focus just on expenditure on newly built properties, excluding the land component, because the idea is land is not being produced, so it shouldn't be included. And then you use a price index. The price index is a price index for newly built apartments and houses. And finally, the user cost approach. Well, we'll come back to that. The question is then, how do you calculate a OOH expenditure for a user cost approach, and how do you construct the price index? I'd say one other thing about the underlying conceptual underpinnings of these methods. Rental equivalence and user cost both focus on trying to measure the service flow generated by owner-occupied housing. Well, net acquisitions, by contrast, is just treating it like a consumer durable. Now, this graph is taken from Hill, Steuer, Walters, just to show you how it can really matter whether you use a price index or a rent index. This is American data in the years leading up to and after the global financial crisis and the problems in the US housing market. So you see that the two dashed lines are two alternative house price indexes in the US, the Case-Shiller one and what's it called, the National House Price Index. So these are two alternative put out by the FHFA. So these are two alternative indexes. And you see this huge rise in house prices when they crash and then they start rising again. But the solid line is owner equivalent rent index used in the US CPI. And you see that the whole global financial crisis just passes it by. Now, and so you see it can make a big difference here whether you use a rent index or a house price index for the OOH price index in a CPI. I would just add one point on rents here. That one of the problems here is this owner equivalent rent series is focusing on existing rental contracts. While if instead you focused on new rental contracts, then there might have been a bit of a spike and crash maybe in the series. So that's that whole other issue here when you talk about a rental index for the rental equivalence method. Should it be just for new rental contracts or existing rents? But anyway, the main point of this graph is just to show you that it can really matter with a price index whether you use a house price index or a rent index. Now, UK is fine, it's got CPIH, but there's a dilemma in the European Union here, because the official main measure of inflation in Europe is the harmonized index of consumer prices, the HICP. And that currently excludes owner-occupied housing. And as I say here, for 20 years at least, Eurostat and the European Central Bank have been pondering this, how to bring owner-occupied housing into the harmonized index. So there's a general agreement it should come in. The problem is how, right? And well, the first problem is the standard method you would use, rental equivalence. The problem with it is that many countries in Eastern Europe and in Southern Europe have very small rental markets. And so many of these countries feel it's infeasible to use rental equivalence because they're not able to match owner-occupied properties often with rented properties. I mean, the rental market will be concentrated mainly apartments in the city centre. So you've got a house in the countryside, you've got nothing to compare it with. So, and then the problem is, given it's a harmonized index, this means all countries have to do it the same way. So if some countries can't do rental equivalence, then that means rental equivalence can't be used in the harmonized index. So for this reason, Eurostat has been trying to implement their net acquisitions approach. Now, ultimately, well, one important reason why it hasn't gone in yet is that one problem this creates is that the harmonized index, the data needs to be supplied quickly to allow it to be constructed. And there's a rule data has to be supplied within 15 days at the end of the month. Now this, for rental equivalence, this would work because rents are in the HICP, so they can get the rental data within 15 days. So rental equivalence in that sense would work, but they can't get many countries, or some countries at least, can't get the price data quickly enough. So that's the main stated reason why it's still not in there. But I would add that there's some other problems with the net acquisitions approach. I think it's problematic that it excludes land from OOH expenditure. I mean, from most people's perspective, land is, the main thing here with housing. And so you'd end up with a relatively low expenditure share. It comes out, the ECB has estimated maybe 9% of the CPI if OOH was included using a net acquisitions method. Other problems are that smaller countries may not be able to construct a reliable price index for new builds because they just don't have enough new builds transacting each year. And a related problem that we've just identified in a paper, Hill, Stroyer and Trojanic, looking at Poland, is that price index in the primary market can seriously lag price index in the secondary market. In Poland, we find by 2 years. This is because the preliminary agreements are signed maybe 2 years before the final transaction takes place. So the bottom line is, I think if you're going to use an acquisitions method, it's probably necessary to use a price index for the whole market, not just new builds. But then this kind of starts undermining the internal consistency of the method to some extent. So let's look at an alternative, which is to use some kind of user cost method. So central banks are kind of nervous about using a user cost method because it's clear from previous work that problems can arise when you try and bring in housing into a price index, into a house price index using a user cost method. I mean, bringing in OOH. So the idea of the OOH is you say the expenditure will be PT times UT, where for a particular property, PT would be its price and UT is the per euro user cost incurred for that property. So PT times UT is the expenditure, and then the price index is just given by the change in total expenditure from one period to the next. Now, how is this term UT constructed? We're going to take a very simple version here, where, for example, you could distinguish between the equity components of a house or an apartment and its mortgage, and have different interest rates for both. But we'll just use a common interest rate here for both equity and the debt part. So we're going to say that for each euro invested in buying the house, you're either foregoing interest on your equity or you're paying interest on your debt. That's the RT part. Delta is the depreciation. Omega is taxes, running costs, and average transaction costs. And we're going to assume here that you can't tax deduct mortgage interest payments, which you can in the United States, but not in most countries. The formula would be more complicated if you can tax deduct mortgage interest payments. And then you've got a risk premium to allow for the fact that owning may be more risky than renting. And then finally, you've got this capital gain term. Now, it's not completely clear to me that in this context, you want to have the expected capital gain rather than the actual capital gain, because you could do this at the end of the period, where you don't compute this, the CPI until the end of the period. So you could actually observe the actual capital gain. But the general consensus is you take an expected capital gain. In the second part, when we look at this equilibrium condition and getting to the equilibrium price rent ratio, then definitely you need the expected capital gain, but it's slightly less clear in this context. We focus on the real interest rate and the real expected capital gain. You could do it in nominal terms instead, and the inflation would cancel out expected inflation. So there are different ways of writing this formula. But anyway, we have a fairly simple version of it. Now, the main problem here with the user cost approach is this capital gain term. If you're not careful with how you include the expected capital gain term, it could cause huge volatility first in your OOH series, but also it can actually destabilize the CPI. And Verbrugge, Garner and Verbrugge and Hill, Stroyer, Walter, we all give examples of how you can destabilize the CPI by, the capital gain term can destabilize the CPI. And I'll show you an example of this later in the talk. And in extreme cases, you can even, when you get very high capital gains, you can even turn negative, in which case the OOH price index isn't even defined, and OOH expenditure will be negative. Now, and when we get to the final part of the talk, I'll talk quite a bit about negative user costs. Okay, so we'll come back to that a bit later. So how would you compute expected real capital gains? Well, the general approach would be to assume that people extrapolate past trends. So if for example, you could take a 5-year horizon, so you look at the average average real capital gain over the last 5 years, and say people assume that's what will happen in the coming year. So you could take a 2-year horizon, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. I mean, there are different possibilities here. Now, the longer the time horizon, that should act to stabilize the index. But in Hill, Stroyer, Walter, we find, looking at the CPI for the city of Sydney, that even 30 years isn't enough to stabilize the index. So an alternative, which we discuss in our paper, is that you could instead fix G to some kind of long-run average value. But the critical thing is fix it when you're comparing periods t-1 and t. And then when you move on to compare periods t and t+1, you could then update it if you wanted. But you see, when you fix it for each comparison between adjacent periods, that has an interesting impact on the user cost formula, and I'll show you that in a minute. But there's another issue here in terms of destabilization, which is R, the interest rate. We show also that changes in the interest rate can destabilize the CPI. And there's another concern here from the perspective of central banks. If they raise interest rates, the last thing they want to do is have inflation immediately jump upwards directly as a consequence of raising interest rates. I mean, if they're doing a contractionary monetary policy to try and get inflation down. And this will tend to happen with the user cost approach if you just allow the interest rate to always be at its current value. I mean, typically, you wouldn't take a 1-year interest rate, you'd take maybe a kind of 10-year interest rate. But even so, and we see that with the Sydney data we look at, which I'll show you a bit later, that even changes in interest rates can have a destabilizing effect and could cause measured inflation to jump upwards. So this is another concern for central banks. They don't want inflation to immediately jump upwards when they increase interest rates. Now, generally, when using the user cost method, the other terms, depreciation, taxes running, and average transaction costs and the risk premium are assumed to be constant. So the focus here is on G and R as the terms that could destabilize the CPI. Now, if you fix them both, in each time, like when you're comparing t-1 and t, you fix the interest rate and the capital gain, then it will follow, therefore, that U will be constant. As I say, when you compare T and T+1, you could then update them if you wanted. So, but in the comparison between T-1 and T, U would be constant. You see it then drops out of the user cost price index. The user cost price index now just becomes a house price index. Now, Statistics Sweden actually uses a method that's a kind of not exactly this, but somewhat related to this. They construct more than one CPI, but one of them does this, actually treats owner-occupied housing a bit in this way. Now, there'd still be the problem, though, as I mentioned earlier, about can countries get this data fast enough? Can they get the price data fast enough to construct an HPI on a monthly basis within 15 days of the end of the month? So even using this user cost method, you've still got this problem, which is creating problems for some countries in Europe. Now, let me just illustrate this method, well, all these methods for including OOH and the CPI by looking at the case of Sydney. We look at Sydney because we have micro-level housing data for Sydney, prices and rents, and also the Australian Bureau of Statistics constructs a CPI for each capital city in the country. So it has a CPI specifically for Sydney, and they present enough information that you can remove owner-occupied housing from the CPI, and then so we can remove it, and then we can put it in using different methods and see what impact it has on the CPI. Now, first of all, using hedonic methods, we construct a sales and rent index. So you see over the period we look at here, 2004 to 2014, rents rose faster than house prices in Sydney. Okay, now this table shows you our results for this period, 2004 to 2014. Now, these methods, U0, U10, U30, and UF are user cost methods. U0 basically means you exclude owner-occupied housing completely. U10 means you extrapolate, you expect whatever the average capital gains over the last 10 years is what you're expecting for the current year. U30 is you're expecting the average capital gain, real capital gain over the last 30 years. That's what you're expecting in the current year. And UF is this alternative method we're suggesting where you fix the capital gain and the interest rate when in each bilateral comparison between adjacent periods. Now you've got the results here based on rental equivalence. And there are two versions of the acquisitions method here as well. One is the Eurostat version of acquisitions. Now that differs from the Australian version because with the Australian version, what they do there is their price index is only the cost of building materials. So the price index also excludes the effect of land, changes in land prices. With the Eurostat version, land prices are in there for the price index, but not for the expenditure share of owner-occupied housing. Now, if you look at the average inflation rates, they're not massive differences over this period, but if you look at what's going on from year to year, you see that, for example, the first 3 user cost methods, you're getting huge volatility in actual CPI inflation here. This is not just the housing part, this is actually the CPI. You see, for example, with U10, you're getting measured inflation of 38% in 2012, 2013. Now, what's going on there? Well, there are a few things combined to cause that big spike in measured inflation in 2012, 2013. One was interest rates went up by a full half percentage point in that year, but also you'd had this boom in Australia from about 1993 or something to about 1992 to about 2004. And so when you're moving this window forward, well, it turns out this is a period whereby by moving forward one period, the expected capital gain goes down a bit, given by just looking at what happened with the historical data. But on top of that, there was a huge surge in house prices in 2011, 2012, 13. You see this in this graph here, how house prices really started rising rapidly. These 3 effects together cause the per dollar here user cost to rise, and in 2012-13, and the price index, the price level in that same period to rise as well. So you get this big increase in U times P. That's what causes this here. But you see, this is I would say U0, U10, and U30 are unusable in a CPI. They just all destabilize the CPI too much. UF though seems to work pretty well, and it's I mean, if you look at the coefficient of variation, it has about the same impact in terms of volatility as rental equivalence does. But remember, you know, like in the context of Europe, rental equivalence, we say it's not possible. This UF alternative, user cost method, where you fix the capital gain and interest rate for each bilateral comparison, then that is viable. Now, but anyway, these acquisitions methods, like the Australian version, it's hardly worth, I would say it's hardly worth even including owner-occupied housing if you do it that way. You've excluded land completely. You've thrown away, it's like you're throwing away the baby with the bathwater, basically. So, but anyway, so there you see the results. I mean, so on average, inflation would be 2.63% if you exclude OOH. If you do it using the Australian version of the acquisitions, it just goes up to 2.7, so it's doing virtually nothing. The Eurostat approach does matter more because land prices are still coming into the price index. But anyway, there you see, this is an example of how the CPI can be affected by how you include owner-occupied housing. Now, I just want to give you one other example here, which is this is now looking at trying to bring owner-occupied housing into the HICP specifically for France and Germany. Now, but we cheat a bit with this. It's not a full level analysis based on the micro level data, but the way we do this is we've got house price indices available for France and Germany, which is half of what you need. And again, we're focusing on our simplified user cost method. So for the price index, we just need a price index for owner-occupied housing. Now, for the expenditure share, we observe what's from Eurostat's website. You can obtain data on the OOH expenditure share if you did rental equivalence. So we just assume in 2006 that the OOH expenditure share is the same as the rental equivalence expenditure share. Then we can use the price index, the price indices for France and Germany, then to update the expenditure shares for France and Germany thereafter. And so then we can actually then do a look at the impact of including OOH using our simplified user cost method. And if you look at that graph, you see that in Germany, the impact is to increase measured inflation. First few years in this sample until about 2014, it doesn't really do much. But then from 2014 after, when house prices are rising more rapidly in Germany, it actually pushes up the the HICP for Germany by a non-trivial amount. With France, it goes in the opposite direction, but including owner-occupied housing here would actually push down the HICP a bit. And so I'll just make one more general point here before moving on to the second case. But if you included owner-occupied housing using this simplified user cost method, it would make the HICP more sensitive, would make any CPI more sensitive to house prices than it would be either using rental equivalents or using an acquisitions method. And this would then have implications for monetary policy. If the central bank is inflation targeting, this means that it would then respond more aggressively in terms of interest rates to what's happening in the housing market. Now, there's some debate, for example, in the years leading up to the global financial crisis, if countries had raised, including the United States, if they'd raised interest rates more aggressively, would there maybe have been less of a crisis, or could the crisis even have been avoided? But if you treated owner-occupied housing using this simplified user cost method, it would, and the central bank was inflation targeting, there would have been a more aggressive response in terms of raising interest rates. So this would have implications. I mean, how you do this, bring in owner-occupied housing, it has implications for monetary policy. And yeah, so, okay, so let me move on then. So the second application then I want to look at is looking at this issue of housing market equilibrium. Now, if you start from the assumption that in equilibrium, let's start from the assumption that in equilibrium, the user cost of owner occupying should equal the cost of renting. The idea being that if say the left-hand side here, PT times UT, if that's higher, so the cost of owner occupying is higher than the cost of renting, then some households should sell, some owner occupiers should sell and switch over to renting. And if they do that, the house prices PT will fall and rents will rise. And so that will bring that formula back towards equilibrium. Okay, so that's kind of the starting point here. Now, if you rearrange that equation, you see that you get the price rent ratio should equal 1 divided by the per dollar or per euro user cost. And so this is an equilibrium condition saying that in equilibrium, the price rent ratio should equal 1 divided by per euro user cost. Now, what you can do now is go and calculate the actual price rent ratio prevailing in the market and compare it with the equilibrium price rent ratio and see which is bigger. So if you find that the actual price rent ratio is higher than the equilibrium price rent ratio, then this is a sign that the price rent ratio is too high, has reached maybe an unsustainable level in the housing market. Right now, so we try to do this specifically now. This is in the second paper, Chen, Hill, and Ho, where we look at specifically the city of Shanghai. We try this out on Shanghai and see how it works. And again, we run into problems. When you try to actually do this in practice, you encounter some problems. Now, the first problem is that is this idea that owner-occupied properties tend to be a better quality than rented properties. So if I go back to this formula, the equilibrium condition PT-UT equals RT, you're implicitly assuming here you're comparing properties, an owner-occupied property of equal quality to a rented property. Now, if there's a systematic tendency for the owner-occupied properties to be of better quality than the rented properties, then this formula isn't going to be right anymore. I mean, well, no, sorry, let me rephrase it. The problem is when you compare the actual price rent ratio and there's a quality mismatch between sort of the average price and the average rent. So your price rent ratio, actual price rent ratio, there's quality bias in there, then it won't be right to compare that with your equilibrium price rent ratio. That's more the point. Okay, so the first thing you have to do here, if you're going to try and implement this method, is try and construct a quality adjusted actual price rent ratio in the market. Now that paper, Chen, Hill, and Hu, we spend quite a lot of the time in the paper dealing with exactly this issue. How do you construct a quality adjusted price rent ratio for based on the Shanghai data? So that's problem number one. But I mean, it's given enough information on the characteristics and the micro level data, it's possible to construct a quality adjusted actual price rent ratio. Now, the second problem is that particularly when the per euro user cost is small, then all these parameters in the user cost formula, they can have a major impact on the resulting equilibrium price rent ratio. So suppose you use close to zero, like suppose it's 0.01, so only just bigger than zero. Now, if you then change the values of some of these parameters, you say, okay, maybe you had a risk premium of 0.01, and now you increase it to 0.02, then that's going to cause the equilibrium price rent ratio to change from 100 to 50, a massive change. So given you can't, it's difficult to measure these things exactly, particularly the risk premium, then there's a bit of uncertainty about exactly what the right value of U is. But when U is small, then in a sense, this method is not going to work well, because you're going to get huge fluctuations in your equilibrium price rent ratio. I just remembered I forgot to say one thing, so let me just back up a moment. When we're looking at these price rent ratios, the rent here we're looking at is the annual rent. So you're taking the price divided by annual rent is what we're looking at here. Okay. So that's a second problem with this method. And in fact, it gets even worse when, well, we'll see in a moment. So we tried doing this on Shanghai for data just for the year 2017. And the thing is, if you look at what was happening to house prices in the years leading up to 2017 in Shanghai, the average real house prices rose on average by 22.8%. Per year from 2006 to 2017, according to data on Joseph Gurko's website. Now, with such huge expected capital gains, it's almost inevitable that the user cost U is going to be negative, because you add up all those other terms. There's no way they're going to add up to 22.8% by comparison. So the assumption here is if households are expecting that past trend to continue, then their perceived user cost will be negative. So we're not saying kind of what the user cost actually is in some sense, because it depends on just what matters here is perceptions that households will perceive, if they extrapolate the past trend, then they are going to expect large capital gains, so large capital gains that from their perspective, the user cost of owner occupying is negative. And here you see from our paper a price index showing how strongly house prices were rising in Shanghai over this period. Right, so okay, we'll come back to that, negative user costs in a moment, but let's just look at the actual price rent ratio in Shanghai first. So the actual price rent ratio we calculated, quality adjusted, was about 68 in Shanghai in 2017. So price equaled about 68 times annual rent. Okay, now quality adjustment incidentally brings it down a bit. If you didn't quality adjust, I mean, like I can't remember now, we had maybe, if it wasn't quality adjusted, it was maybe about 73, and then quality adjusting it brings it down to about 68. Now, this is extremely high. A price rent ratio of 68 is extremely high by international standards. Barasa, Hosley, and Oikarinen, for example, look at Helsinki, Geneva, Zurich, Chicago, Miami, and San Francisco, and their price rent ratios are quality unadjusted. So if you and they end up with estimates of 16.1 for Chicago and 37 for Geneva, and the others in between. If you quality adjusted, they'd even be slightly lower. So and Brack and Halkett, Nesheim, and Oswald, they both look at London. Brack gets an estimate of about 25, and Halkett, Nesheim, Oswald between 20, around about 20. These, in their case, fares are quality adjusted. But you see that in Shanghai, the expected capital, I mean, the price rent ratio observed, equally quality adjusted price rent ratio is extremely high. Now, the question then is it too high? Has the price rent ratio reached an unsustainable level? Well, what does this, so can this idea of an equilibrium price rent ratio help us here? Well, we have a problem. The problem is that, well, let me go, well, okay, we've got the formula there. We say that the equilibrium price rent ratio equals 1 over U. Now, look what happens when U tends to 0. As U tends to 0, the equilibrium price rent ratio tends to infinity. And when U is negative, it's still going to be infinite. So the implication here is that this equilibrium price rent ratio approach is saying the equilibrium price rent ratio is infinite in Shanghai. So if you believe that, then you say, well, of course it's sustainable. Then the price rent ratio is less than infinity. But I would argue, well, we'd argue that that's not the right way to interpret what's going on. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But let's just ask this. Well, sorry. Let's continue. Yeah, sorry. I'll continue with this. What we would argue is really happening here is you don't have an interior solution. What we have instead is a corner solution where everyone wants to own or occupy. And as a result, in equilibrium, when you get a corner solution where everyone wants to own or occupy, in equilibrium, you're going to have the user cost is going to be less than the rent. And that's an equilibrium because we've got a corner solution. But then that begs the question, how could such an outcome ever arise? Why would anyone want to rent when the user cost is negative? Well, at least in Shanghai, there is an answer to that. Due to some special circumstances of the city. The first one is that in China, you typically have to pay a 30% deposit when you buy. So all those households that haven't yet saved their 30% deposit are forced to rent. Also, there are residency requirements that have to be satisfied to buy. If you want to buy in Shanghai, you have to have lived there for 2 years as an official resident before you are eligible to buy. Also, foreign residents, it is almost impossible for foreigners, well, let me rephrase it, extremely difficult for foreigners to buy in Shanghai. So almost all the foreign residents are renting as well. And then you've also have categories like short-term visiting students and other visitors who wouldn't want to buy and incur the transaction costs if they're only going to be there for a short period of time. And on top of that, the vacancy rate is rising in Shanghai. So hence we would argue that the corner solution is feasible here in Shanghai. Not only feasible, we think that's actually what's happening. That everyone wants to buy, but there are a significant number of households who are forced to rent for one reason or another, and so there is still a rental market. The rental market doesn't completely disappear. I mean, in fact, it's quite a big rental market because these groups add up to a lot of people. Okay, so what's then actually happening in this corner solution? Well, the equilibrium condition now is that in equilibrium, then the cost of owner occupying is less than the cost of renting. And if you then let U go to 0 and then let it go negative, you then what we've got then is basically an upper bound. It's providing an upper bound on the price rent ratio. And the upper bound here is infinity. So what we end up with out of this user cost approach is saying that the upper bound on the equilibrium price rent ratio in Shanghai is infinity, which, if you think about it, is not very helpful, right? To be told that using this approach just tells us that the equilibrium price rent ratio must be less than infinity. But there's no inconsistency then, in the sense that it's just that this approach doesn't help us in this context. But the final comment on this is that there is an alternative view, an alternative way of using this equilibrium price rent ratio approach, where you maybe do get some useful result out, which is to approach it in a different way. Say, suppose you assume that the housing market is in equilibrium, so the cost of owner occupying equals the cost of renting. So in that case, we say that U equals the actual rent divided by actual prices. So if you take the reciprocal of the price rent ratio, that's what's called a rental yield. So here we're saying that per dollar user or per euro, whatever, per yuan user cost equals the rental yield. Okay, so if you start with that assumption, you assume that it's an interior equilibrium. And then you put in all the other values of all the components of U, and then back out what the expected capital gain must be for the housing market to be in equilibrium. So you derive it as a residual. So we tried this approach for Shanghai, and we end up with an answer that the real capital gain would need to be 5.8% per year. So if the real expected capital gain was 5.8%, then the user cost would equal the cost of renting. So then, now first thing to note, of course, is 5.8% is a lot lower than 22%, which has been the performance over the 10 preceding years on average per year. So for this, to get to an interior equilibrium, we would need house expectations to have fallen a lot compared with past performance. But it's also just worth putting it in context, though. 5.8% real capital gains, how high is that by international standards? Well, Gorko, Meyer, and Sinai have a paper where they look at the average annual real capital gains for 50 US cities over the period 1950 to 2000. And they find that the city with the highest real capital gains was San Francisco, with 3.5% real gains per year, and the average was 1.7%. So this is way higher. I mean, even the capital gain required for equilibrium is way higher than anything observed in the United States. Now, so an overall conclusion on this is, clearly the expected capital gains can't keep growing, can't stay at 22% every year, year on year in the future. So they've got to come down at some point. Maybe eventually they come down to something more like this figure, but it's probably not going to happen immediately. I would expect this negative user cost to persist for some years. Of course, other things going on, like the vacancy rate rising in Shanghai, will also make people think a bit more about buying and with the hope of renting out the apartment rather than living in it. Gradually Shanghai will adjust, but I think it's not unreasonable to say at the moment the user cost is negative. Okay, so then the final slide to summarize. So as we've been saying here, these are two completely different, two different applications of the user cost approach to owner-occupied housing. One is to try and bring owner-occupied housing into a measure of inflation, or an alternative way of doing it, and the second is how to determine whether the housing market is out of equilibrium. So with regard to the measurement of inflation, you have to be careful if you want to use the user cost approach. If you're not careful, it can destabilize the CPI. So it has to be used carefully. But we argue that there are ways of doing it where you would not destabilize the CPI, and in our opinion, particularly in the context of the HICP, where rental equivalence doesn't seem to be an option, we think this kind of a simplified user cost method may be preferable to an acquisitions method. The expenditure share on owner-occupied housing will be higher if you do it using this kind of user cost method we're suggesting. It just, our sense is that by not throwing out land, you're getting an expenditure share that's too low if you do an net acquisitions approach. And then regarding the interpreting price-rent ratios and finding an equilibrium price-rent ratio, again, you have to be careful, particularly when you're dealing with a city or country where U is small. When it's close to zero, then small changes in these parameter values can have a big impact, and also even more so if the expected capital gains are large enough to cause U to go negative. Then you have to really step back and think about what's happening, and the implication is, yes, that you have a corner solution, and so you have to, this equality condition then becomes an inequality, which is actually useless, because it's just saying the equilibrium price-rent ratio is less than infinity. So then it's maybe more useful to follow this alternative approach, where saying what would a capital gain have to be for the housing market to be in equilibrium. Okay, so thank you. That's everything.
Thank you very much, Robert. That's a really interesting illustration of some of the issues in trying to bring housing into the inflation metrics, and also broader uses of these indices. So we have quite a few questions, and so we'll start with Martin Wheel. If I could ask Martin to unmute his microphone, and then after that we'll go to Cam Yu.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Robert, for a very interesting talk. I had a couple of points rather than questions going back to when at the ONS we looked at how to put housing into the CPI. The net acquisitions model we looked at as genuine net acquisitions, i.e. the purchases by the household sector less the sales by the household sector, and the trouble that or at least an issue that concerned me, was that for 15 years sales exceeded acquisitions, so net acquisitions were negative and should therefore go in with a negative weight. Now, you obviously avoid that problem if you look only at new builds and spending on new builds, but you're doing that by departing from the idea of net acquisitions. The other point which concerned us and put us off user cost was what you highlighted in the second part of your talk, that when house prices are rising rapidly, user cost is very low or close to zero, and to tell people that housing costs are falling because prices are going up is going to lead to confusion with the public. So those, as much as the data issues, were why we ended up with the imputed rent story.
Well, just by answer to that, I've no problem with rental equivalence as a method, but as I say, it's really, I guess that part is pitched particularly at the European Central Bank and Eurostat, where countries have said they can't do rental equivalence. So then the question is, if you can't do it, then what do you do? Do you leave owner-occupied housing out, or do you do net acquisitions, or do you do user cost?
No,
so,
I take that. Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry, I take that point.
Yeah, so I have no trouble with. I mean, rental equivalence is the safest way to do it when you can, when your rental market is big enough that you can do it. Yes, thanks.
If we could have Cam Yu, if you would be able to unmute your microphone, and then we'll go to Michael Joffe.
Okay, thanks. Hi, Robert. Nice to see you again. I have two comments. The first one is the CPI is supposed to measure the change in the cost of living index, but when you talk about capital gain, I see it rather as an income change. So that should be separated from the CPI. That's my first comment. My second one is by invoking the equilibrium condition. In a way, we're talking about the efficient market hypothesis. I think it's a bit troubling here, because if we believe in the efficient market hypothesis, there won't be a housing bubble anyway. That's my comment. Thanks.
Well, I mean, both Cam and Martin. I mean, this expected capital gain it is no question it's a problem in however you're going to do the user cost. Yeah, you can make a case. The case has been made, but you should exclude capital gains completely in this context, because they're kind of coming in as kind of negative expenditure, which you could say doesn't make sense in a CPI context. I mean, that argument has been made, which I think is what I think, Cam, was kind of your first point. And coming back to what Martin was saying as well, suppose we were talking about setting the capital gain equal to some kind of long run value, but if you had a sustained boom, I mean, even that could be high enough in principle to make the user cost go to zero or negative, and that is a problem. Yeah. So one alternative is just to exclude the capital gain term completely, saying that this is some kind of asset revaluation thing, and it's not then part of consumption, and so it shouldn't be in the CPI context. It needs to be in there when you're doing this equilibrium condition, but you could argue that maybe it doesn't need to be in there at all when you do when you're doing the user cost approach for including inflation in the CPI. With the second point from Cam, I'm a bit confused. I mean, you say efficient markets hypothesis, I don't think precludes bubbles happening, and certainly big corrections. So I don't know quite where to go with that. And certainly, I mean, you can understand why in China you would have had such very strong capital gains for a while, because it was this radical transformation of the economy and very rapid growth in income. And then, of course, some of that future house prices already incorporate some of the expectations of future rises in income, which explains why house prices rise so rapidly. So it's I don't think it's showing any kind of market inefficiency as such that house prices have risen so rapidly in China. So being this incredible transformation of the economy, combined then with people anticipating future rises in income as well, and factoring those already into house prices. Yeah, thanks.
I wonder if we could take a question from Joe Grice next, and then go to Michael Joffe. Joe, would you be able to unmute your microphone?
Thank you very much. I was very struck. Well, first of all, a very interesting talk, of course, and very thought-provoking. I was struck, you glossed over a little bit about actual versus expected capital gains. And it seems to me they're used for different reasons and different purposes. If you're trying to think about the statistics at all, and I take it some people, but not me, feel that capital gains should be excluded, then it seems to me you're actually interested only in the actual capital gain. That's what actually happened. You would record that at the end of the period.
Yeah.
If, as in part of your talk, much of your talk, you're thinking about how to use this to help the analysis of what actually happened, or indeed what is going to happen, then it seems to me the expected capital gain is much more relevant. That's actually what drives behavior.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that the argument that if you're not careful, you'll destabilize the CPI is a little bit dangerous, because the objective of compiling a price index, an official index at least, is not to produce some kind of smooth index that we're comfortable with, but actually to describe reality. What the reality is that my house in London has gained 40% in price over the last 5 years. That's part of reality. If it had gone down by 40%, that would also have been part of reality. So I just wonder if some of the issues you raise can't be resolved just by being clearer about what these two terms are, different reasons. And finally, it seems to me it's precisely in these kind of conditions where expected and actual capital gains can diverge enormously over time. You'd expect the kind of speculative bubble market that often does characterize housing.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So, well, with the first point, yes, I totally agree, but you can make a strong case in the inflation context saying you should include the actual capital gain, because you can, from a theoretical point of view, because you can measure, you're not measuring it till the end of the period, so you can see what actually happened. But certainly in the second case, where you're looking at do you want to rent or own, then it needs to be the expected capital gain. But a problem, I forgot to say this in this presentation, but if you actually then try and put in actual capital gains in that user cost formula when you're measuring inflation, you can also get massive swings I mean, that can also destabilize the CPI. I mean, if you have a period where house prices have risen rapidly, but yeah, the user costs could go negative or certainly to zero. And then when you get a crash in the housing market, it can go, then the user costs can go way up. So it can be destabilizing, which brings, of course, on to the second point. I agree that's a tricky issue, but it's right. In a sense, you want to be measuring what's really happening rather than feeling you've got to produce a kind of smooth series. That's true, but on the other hand, at least if you extrapolate over a short time horizon or use the actual observed ex post capital gains, you can end up having such a destabilizing effect on the CPI that this would create a serious problems for a central bank. we're trying to do monetary, but particularly for central bank, is inflation targeting. Right, so this is going to imply then maybe huge fluctuations in interest rates as well to deal with well, although of course monetary policy is supposed to be forward-looking, so you don't necessarily respond directly to everything, but still this would cause potentially big problems for a central bank if it's inflation targeting and you're getting these huge fluctuations in inflation coming from the way owner-occupied housing is coming in. So I think central banks in general would say no. In that case, we would rather not have owner-occupied housing in the CPI or harmonized index in the case of Europe at all. But whether that's right or not is another matter, because as you say, this is if that's the reality of the situation. Sorry, Joe, I've forgotten your third comment now. What was the third one?
Don't worry, it's that's a really nice answer. I'd leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Right. Thanks for those questions and responses so far. So we'll go to Michael Joffe, and then we'll have a comment from Paul Koning.
Hello, this is a naive question because I'm a total outsider in this particular field. My question is that based on the observation that rent is not equivalent to mortgage because a mortgage is finite in duration. And after that, the cost of one's housing as an owner-occupier is zero. How does your method, the use of cost method, and indeed the other methods account for this?
Well, okay, thanks, Michael. One interesting angle in all of this is, what are you using a CPI for? But it's used for two main purposes of it, I guess. One is for indexing payments like pensions, salaries, things like this. And the other one is for monetary policy, for setting interest rates. And now, you could say that maybe the treatment of owner-occupied housing maybe should be influenced by which purpose you have in mind. I mean, certainly, generally, the central bank wins out, and it's done the way the central bank wants it for monetary policy. But there's certainly this problem that if you're a pensioner, say, and you own your property, you're a pensioner, and then when you include owner-occupied housing, that's pushing inflation up, then your pension is being increased. When you have, and maybe you have no mortgage, you own your property, and then you're getting a bigger pension, which is problematic. Then, but there is this in the whole context of indexation of pensions and wages. It's tricky, and essentially, you want to have two different CPIs. Then, one for owners, owner-occupiers, and one for renters. But maybe you should be compensating the renters for rises in the cost of owner-occupied housing, because then it's hard, it's harder for them to enter the housing market if they want, but it's not clear you need to compensate owner-occupiers for increases in house prices after they have purchased their property. So I don't know quite whether that's the angle you were coming at, but there's certainly some interesting issues in that regard.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Paul Koning, you wanted to make a comment, and then we'll go to John Samuels.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca. So I'm Paul Koning. I'm responsible at Eurostat for the HICP and the house price indexes and owner-occupied house price indices. And I would like to thank Robert first very much for the interesting presentation. I'd just like to make a small comment here. So we are, and the European countries are producing for the last, say, 10 years, separate owner-occupied house price indexes based on the net acquisition approach. This is on a quarterly basis. And this index is indeed set up with the aim to eventually one day to combine with the HICP or even integrate into the HICP. In this OOH, as Robert rightly pointed out, the prices include land, but in the expenditures we exclude land, because we believe that the exclusion of the land is the appropriate form for the HICP, which is for the main purpose is a monetary policy target indicator. So we are not able yet to exclude the land prices from the price side of the index, but we do exclude them from the weights. So you argued, Robert, for actually that the land should be included to cover more of the impact, of course, of these land prices. But for monetary policy, the argument goes the other way. And this is also what we're facing at the moment. There's the ECB has asked us now to start producing a quarterly combined index of the HICP and the OHPI. But one of the stumble blocks is indeed forever including this in in the HICP is this issue of asset prices included in an inflation target. And that also comes to then your argument for the user cost approach, at least the one you present for the as the best option for the HICP. My understanding is that your version basically introduces the house price index in full into the HICP. That would, in our view, exaggerate further the issue of asset elements in a target measure. So that was my comment. Thank you.
Can I just make one comment on that? Thank you, Paul. I mean, of course, this user cost method we're suggesting actually isn't so different from the acquisitions method, in the sense, the price index is more or less the same, but it's just it'll be a price index for new builds versus a price index for all properties. So the main thing is just the expenditure share would be bigger using the user cost method we're suggesting. That would be bigger than for acquisitions. But of course, I mean, one way of solving the volatility problem is to say that you just focus on the you exclude land completely, so that's that get a smaller expenditure share, but still it's non-trivial. I mean, as I understand, the ECB reckons about 9% on average if you do the acquisitions method, and if you exclude land from the price index, then owner-occupied housing included that way will be it should not do too much to destabilize the HICP if it's brought in that way. But of course, there's a problem then of how do you separate the land from the structure in the house price index? That's a difficult kind of econometric problem. So yes, thanks. Okay, so we're going to have a question from John Samuels, and then I think we'll have run a couple of minutes over, if that's okay, and I have a question from Jill Leyland.
Yeah, hi, Robert. Presuming you could hear me, a really useful talk. And you've been framing this from the perspective of the CPI, but as you've been talking through your results, I've been trying to think about this from a productivity perspective, and and I've been doing that by thinking about this sort of as the rental equivalence price as sort of the output price, and then the user cost as the input price. And because there's a difference between the two, as you said, this is sort of alternatively thought about as productivity change in the provision of owner-occupied housing. And I'm wondering if that's a reasonable interpretation, or we sort of immediately have to move to this disequilibrium story that you've used to evaluate the difference between the owner equivalence method and the user cost method. And then if we do think about this as productivity change in the provision of owner-occupied housing, are your results sensible with that interpretation, or they're completely crazy if we think about this difference as productivity change?
Sorry, I don't quite follow that. You're saying that the productivity change, so what would be the productivity change? Can you say that again?
So you could think about measuring productivity as a difference between output prices and input prices. Yes. And the user cost is basically the input price, and the rental equivalent method is the output price. So the difference between those two is a measure of productivity change. And so, right, that moves away from your disequilibrium story, but in practice, given these two observed prices, is it reasonable to interpret this difference as productivity change? And if we do that, do we get crazy productivity change in the provision of owner-occupied housing?
Well, I've never thought about it that way. I have to say, I'll have to think about it. But it sounds like an interesting idea I mean, so this can be yet another sort of way of looking at this. I'll have to think about it. I don't have an immediate reply as to how that's likely to work, but it's certainly an interesting way of looking at it that I'd never thought of before. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much for that. And Jill Leyland, if you want to ask your question.
Thanks very much. Robert, that was a fascinating talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're developing in the UK household costs indices, which are aiming to measure inflation as actually experienced by households. In other words, it's effectively a payments approach. So we are looking at things like mortgage interest and potentially mortgage capital payments. I wondered if you had any immediate thoughts on that. I'd hope eventually, one other point is that they are being developed for different groups of the population. So the problem you mentioned in your response to Michael Joffe that, for the household cost indices, there will be an index for pensioners, for owner occupiers and so forth.
Right. Yes. Well, so clearly this kind of approach is aimed at the payments side of the CPI, not at monetary policy, presumably. So
yes.
Yeah. So I'd have to think about certainly I think there's a case for in a sense two different, maybe more than two CPIs, one for monetary policy, one for payments, and then for payments really for indexation. So for then you really again may ideally need more than one CPI there as well. So I agree with that general kind of a principle. The only problem is, of course, if you have a proliferation of different CPIs, that can also cause confusion. But nevertheless, I see the point of producing these different CPIs, and clearly, particularly this distinction between monetary policy and indexation. But like I say, I mean, particularly for housing, owners and renters, there may be a case for different CPIs. I mean, you could say older people, younger people, maybe as well. But the actual mechanics, I'd have to look at the actual mechanics of how that method works. I mean, so as I understand it, the idea would be that the whole mortgage payment would be included, not just the interest on the mortgage. But I'd need to think more about that as to what might be. So, but it sounds like it's some kind of variant on a user cost method. I guess yes, it's an example of a payments approach, which is that's one. It's a version, or it lies somewhere between a user cost and payments approach, which is another type of method, but I didn't discuss today. But yeah, I should look at that more. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, perhaps we can follow up separately.
Thank you very much. So I think we're running out of time here, even though we don't have time to answer all the questions. But so just thank you, Robert, for an excellent talk, and also for excellent responses to the questions from the audience. And also thanks to the audience for their questions. Lots of ideas here and things to reflect on. Just before we close, just a couple of advertisements. The next talk in this series is on the 4th of November with Robert Inclar on product variety, cost of living, and welfare across countries. So please join us for that. And also I wanted to highlight a conference that we're running with the International Association of Research in Income and Wealth on intangibles and their contributions to growth. That conference is on the 11th and 12th of November at RSA House in London. And we have keynotes from Dan Sickle and Jonathan Haskell. So if you are in the UK, please join us. You can register on our website. So thanks again, Robert, and thanks to the audience.